for our second in the Oosterhaven lecture series. We're delighted to have Dr. Harrison Howard with us, and our colleague Travis West will give him a more proper introduction. I just want to say a word about this lecture series itself. The lectureship is named for M. Eugene Oosterhaven, the late Albertus C. Van Raalte Professor of Systematic Theology at Western Theological Seminary. When Dr. Oosterhaven retired, his local church, Central Park Reformed, where he and his wife Margaret were members, as well as other friends, came together to help endow this lectureship series. The lectureship is intended for focus on some aspect of the contemporary relevance of Reformed theology. And it began in 1987, and it includes a number of well-known theologians, including Martin Marty, Wolfhart Pannenberg, Leslie Newbegin, I. John Hesselink, Justo Gonzalez, Bruce McCormick, Ellen Sherry, Nicholas Wolterstorff, Amy Plantinga-Paw. 3 sets of Oosterhaven lectures went on to be published, including by Newbegin, Pannenberg, and Gonzalez. And about 3 years ago, the lectureship was expanded. It used to always be selected by the theology field, and now it rotates fields. So you are officially our first guest in the biblical field, and we're delighted to have you help us expand this lectureship just a bit. I never got to meet Gene Oosterhaven, and I don't know that anyone in this room did either. That's we actually.
I was a student.
You were a student. Okay.
And just a brief story, he loved canoeing.
Mm-hmm.
And he used to, of course, we had mostly male students in those days, and he was appalled at the lack of strength of the male students to lift the canoe and get it into the river and all that kind of thing. That's a non-theological.
So we were hearing rumors that perhaps you did push-ups in class. Is this the true rumor, or handstands, or?
Oh yes, there was a lot of that. I used to go to the Dow Center at noon to work out. And he was in amazing shape for somebody in the 60s.
Yeah, there's a story in this article that was published upon his retirement that at his 70th birthday party, he was doing push-ups for everybody. He has a lot for us to live up to. But he invested deeply in Western Theological Seminary. I think he taught here for 36 or 37 years, which is a huge investment. And he loved the church, the Reformed church, as well as the global church. His wife is from Hungary, and that invited him to have a deep love of the Reformed church throughout the world as well. And then they also mentioned his canoe trips, and he would take along students, and loved the Sierra Club and all things related to God's good earth. So in the spirit of Gene Oosterhaven, please join me in welcoming Travis West, who has done so much to bring this together, who will then introduce our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, Kristen. So Emerson Powery, our speaker this evening, is professor of biblical studies at Messiah University. His scholarship has resulted in a number of very important books. A couple from my own shelf are a book he co-wrote called The Genesis of Liberation, Biblical Interpretation in the Antebellum Narratives of the Enslaved, and he was one of the principal editors for True to Our Native Land, an African-American commentary on the New Testament. He was also one of the editors of the Common English Bible, or one of the sort of editors of the translation process. And he has a forthcoming book on which these lectures are based called Good Samaritan, Luke 10 for the Life of the Church. But beyond the titles of Emerson's scholarship, one of the things I really appreciate about the content and the character of his scholarship is how carefully and sensitively he attends to matters of hermeneutics and methodology. As he mentioned several times in this afternoon's lecture, how we tell the story matters. His scholarship is an example of that truth. Emerson has a capacity to peel back the writings of various authors and then articulate with nuance and respect, and dare I say, even love, what commitments and convictions inform their conclusions. He also is self-aware enough to notice and name the same in his own work. This ability to lovingly listen both to what's said and what stands behind what's said is a profoundly important gift that Dr. Powery's work and witness models to us in our current cultural moment of division, suspicion, polarization, and non-curiosity. It's important for me to note explicitly that this appears to me to be motivated by love and a desire to understand, to truly hear what the person he's engaging with is trying to say. In that way, I think Dr. Powery's work is a model for those of us in seminary and in the church of one important way to put into practice, within the practices of our profession and our callings, the very message of the Good Samaritan, namely, to love our neighbors. Dr. Powery, thank you for your work, your words, and your witness. Thank you for demonstrating the integration of what you study with how you study it, instead of the all too common and ironic alternative in which the message is undermined by a speaker's failure to inhabit the message they're trying to communicate. And that way, you're a breath of fresh air. So please come and breathe a fresh word into our midst again this evening. Please welcome Dr. Powery.
Good evening. Sorry, I'm a little, thank you for that. The entire project of the Good Samaritan begins for me with ideas coming from lots of places. But I would say for our purposes this evening, I'm not sure my parents would articulate it this way, so that's what bringing me a little pause here, but these are ideas borrowed from a deep past, borrowed from a place among the enslaved, borrowed from a theology from below, if you will. That is, if you think about someone like Frederick Douglass, Harriet, Jacobs, James Pennington, and so many other unnamed enslaved people who held on to the God of Christian faith despite so many things. It's one of the questions that after people who read the Genesis of Liberation book often ask me, why did they hang on, right? It's very difficult to answer. I would say that they had a theology that mattered bodily. Some today may not classify these black formerly enslaved people as theologians. Perhaps they were not in the classical sense of that term, but they were deep thinkers and often thought about the predicament in which they and others find themselves in these United States in the pre-Civil War era, while attempting to understand the consequences of life and movement and freedom and God and others. As some have recognized, for example, Frederick Douglass penned his narrative in the spirit of St. Augustine's Confessions, considered one of the great theological treatises of the early church. In Douglass's conception of the church, he stipulated that there were two types of Christianities represented in the land. In his appendix to his first narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, he senses the need to explain his severe critique of the Christianity he experienced, lest his anti-racist views be misinterpreted as anti-Christian. After reading over his own narrative, he says, he pens these words: "I have spoken in such a tone and manner respecting religion as may possibly lead those unacquainted with my religious views to suppose me an opponent of all religion. What I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion of this land, and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slaveholding, women whipping, cradle plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. This is my starting point for reflecting theologically on the biblical stories of the gospel. I do not assume that there is a single Christian theological perspective that all Christians share. In fact, the impact of the Protestant Reformation has taught us otherwise. There are many expressions of Christian faith and a variety of theologies that accompany those expressions. Many Christians think of the Christian faith in the singular, even while most of us, same Christians, recognize the variety among us. In reality, not only do diverse Christians have different faith confessions, what counts as sacraments, for example, but they also live their lives differently. What counts as sin is a debate among Christians. My beginning assumption is difference, that there are differences among Christian practices and interpretations. This assumption has a direct impact even on the way I interpret the canonical Gospels. I see difference in those accounts as well, even theological distinctions at times. Many biblical interpreters share these assumptions. If this is how the early Christian movement began, then perhaps there's some benefit for contemporary Christians to appreciate more the diversity among us. In turn, appreciation for these differences can make us value our own particular expression of the Christian faith even more. I grew up in a church in which communion or the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist was considered a sacrament, even though we practiced it only monthly. Now I attend a church in which we practice the Eucharist weekly. Reflecting theologically on these differences can become an interesting reflective exercise of engagement in the practices and beliefs of the faith and historical traditions that have led to this moment. On the other hand, the kind of difference Douglas raises is a difference that relates to the dignity of human beings. His discussion taps into the essential ways in which ecclesial practices touch directly on the practices of everyday living. It expresses the deepest connections between the life of the soul and the life of the body. In fact, a theology that distinguishes too neatly between body and soul obscures the embodied nature of theological commitments a church makes. The theological test becomes straightforward, even though complex. What difference does a theology make on the way Christ followers live in relationship to others who are not like them? In The Ideological Spirit of the Enslaved, Toni Morrison captures the fickleness and fleeting moments of community in her 9th novel, A Mercy, and the importance of recognizing alternative perspectives. The Nobel Laureate's book exposes the challenge of living with a diverse group of people and how larger social constraints limit freedom and human choice. A Mercy begins with the 16-year-old Florence, who narrates her confusion over her separation from her enslaved mother, a confusion that will not be explained to the reader until the final chapter of the book. Florence finds herself in the care of Jacob Vark, a landowner who has unwillingly secured Florence as payment for a debt. Vark despises human bondage, so he interprets this business transaction as an opportunity to save an orphan. When Vark arrives home to a 120-acre plantation he has inherited from his deceased uncle, he hopes that his spouse will warmly accept Florence, a child who is near the age their daughter would have been had she not died. He is mistaken. His wife's attitude is more neutral toward Florence than Vark had hoped. Through Morrison's gifted pen, other characters make up this contrived family. A Native American servant Vark had purchased from the Presbyterians some years earlier, an intellectually disabled, racially ambiguous individual who has been traumatized by a shipwreck, and 2 white day laborers who apparently have queer leanings. In a 12-chapter story told through the internal reflections of various characters, Morrison sets this family in Virginia in the late 1600s when America and race, I should do America and race, because for Morrison, that's what's happening. America is coming into its own, developing its own self-identity. Race is kind of a construct in this period, right? And the idea of family so this is what Morrison is kind of playing with. Vark's death changes everything. As it harmed so many during those times, smallpox takes his life shortly after the construction of a large home. His partner survives her battle with the disease, but she refuses to allow anyone, including herself, to move into the large edifice that they had built. The refusal to live in this dwelling is symbolic of the decreasing humane interactions among those who remain alive, as the small, diverse community slowly perishes as well. As Morrison puts it, reflecting back on her own work, I wanted this group to be the earliest example of American individuality, but it does not last, because there's nothing outside to hold them together. Whether race, institution, tribe, religion, nothing holds them together. Readers do not learn the origins of the title of the book until the final chapter. Florence's mother, who remains unnamed throughout the novel, explains her efforts to secure Florence an alternative living space. Her master had been in debt to Jacob Vark. When Vark had visited her plantation in Maryland, she had noticed how different he seemed from her own master. He did not look at her with any particular sexual interest when she set the table, served the food, and cleaned up following the meal. Vark seemed hardly to notice her at all. When she learned that her master was going to attempt to use them as human collateral, she schemed to have Florence receive Vark's attention. His willingness to take her daughter became, in her mind, the title of the book, A Mercy. For a mother to participate, or to be forced to participate in the sale of her own daughter, becomes an ethical query about the whole structural system in which she and her owners find themselves. Florence, on the other hand, never learns the truth. This revelation is a burden the reader must carry alone. What can we gain from A Mercy for reading Jesus' parables? Morrison's novel, indeed her entire au revoir, has been about the way we read a shared history and thereby understand each other. Morrison is a genius at capturing the internal struggles of individuals of less status. It's not only the characters in positions of power who speak and offer their descriptions about the world and their feelings about a given situation. Morrison also brings to the world's attentions those overlooked voices in democratic Western society's great novels. These so-called minor characters receive much attention in Morrison's novels as thinking, speaking, thriving people on their own, even when the circumstances of life apparently dictate many of their actions. As Morrison describes her own writing life, writing has been about a journey for freedom. She wanted her books to contain the incomplete feelings that the African American spirituals represent. In her words, I want my books to be like that, the spirituals, because I want that feeling of something held in reserve and the sense that there is more, that you can't have it all right now. She accomplishes this goal with A Mercy. It may just be that Jesus' parables are like the spirituals too. Unless readers, thinkers, and believers are comfortable with the inevitable gaps the spirituals allow, they will struggle with Morrison's novels and perhaps with Jesus' parables too. As we did in the earlier talk this afternoon, let me introduce the parable here with an imaginative retelling before we turn our attention to the Solentiname community in Nicaragua and Harriet Jacobs. Why? I asked Saul. Why did you agree to take this man in? Do you not know that his presence could ruin us? We have a business to run. Now you will be preoccupied with his care, or I suspect you will expect me to handle his care. If I'm busy doing that, who will prepare meals for the other guest? Those were my initial reactions when my husband returned from the brief conversation with the Samaritan stranger. It was odd enough that we were allowing the Samaritan and his wounded friend to spend the night. In some ways, we had no choice, since it was so late in the evening when they arrived and the man on the mule was in poor shape. Even though I had been standing at a distance, I could see that the man's wounds were bleeding through the poorly wrapped bandages. What kind of Jews would we be if we did not let them stay the night? When Saul had awoken early to meet with the Samaritan on the next day, I had assumed that it was to receive the final payment for the night's stay and to bid farewell. But after the exchange, the Samaritan man had departed without his partner and without his animal. I was confused until Saul explained what was happening. I couldn't help but react, "Why did you agree?" Initially, Saul attempted to calm my concerns. "Don't worry. The Samaritan plans to return in a couple of days." I reacted again. "You can't believe that will happen, do you? You know how most people are, and this is a Samaritan stranger who came in the middle of the night." And Saul told me about the man's promise to reimburse us for any expenses. "Really?" I said at the top of my voice. "You accepted a promise from this foreigner?" As I turned and began storming out of the front room, I could hear Saul saying in my direction, "Whoever gives to the poor will lack nothing, but one who turns a blind eye will get many a curse." "Don't fool yourself," I shouted back. "You're no King Solomon." I wish I had a few more laughs at that ending line, but okay. I'll accept what I get at this point. It's been a long day. The parable of the Samaritan is a story about something other than forgiveness. One community that exemplifies this intermingling of the religious and the political, centered around an interpretation of the parable of the Samaritan, is the Nicaraguan community of Solentiname. This community provides us with a communal Bible study based in the 1970s, organized, led, and recorded by Ernesto Cardinal, a Catholic priest who was also a well-known poet in some circles, including during his time living under the mentorship of Thomas Merton. In light of the teacher of the law's question in Luke 10, one of the participants replies, "What was happening then with the law is happening now with the gospel." Jesus' question to the lawyer, "What do you read there?" captures this Nicaraguan group's attention. Priest Cardinal, as leader of the Bible study, continues this direction. It's as if a supporter of this regime should ask us what we think of the Gospels. That could be a dangerous question, couldn't it? The danger of their biblical interpretation may be found throughout this recorded Bible study. As Cardinal will acknowledge in later reflections on these communal gatherings, the gospel made us political revolutionaries. Similar to their North American counterparts, many Solentiname interpreters present a strong bias against the lawyer. For example, in reaction to the lawyer's response to Jesus to love God and love neighbor, one of the participants, Loreno, says, "Jesus makes him say things he doesn't do." This contributor assumes the insincerity of the lawyer, which may be tapping into Luke's description of the lawyer as well as one who was seeking to justify himself. Other contributors move beyond the Lucan text altogether. An unnamed person suggests that the lawyer may have wanted to argue about other laws that were nonsense, giving specific examples such as worship in the temple, the Sabbath, unclean food, purification. Alejandro suggests that the lawyer realizes he had never loved his neighbor. He loved God, but neighbor, up to then, he didn't even know who that was. Olivia picks up this thread but spins it around. He didn't know his neighbor because he didn't have love. A few comments later, she says, "Your neighbors are all of humanity." This revolutionary spirit, evident in this gathering, is often quite interested in love. That is, who has it, how it is defined, and to whom it is given. Finally, Rebecca at least gives the lawyer credit for what she calls a selfish love. That is, love for his children, love for his close friends, just not love for others. North American academic critiques of liberation theological interpreters' tendencies suggest that liberationists often provide anti-Semitic readings. To be fair, this inclination is not exclusive to liberation exegetes. Many North American Christian interpreters draw similar conclusions on Jewish characters who challenge Jesus in the Gospels. Just come into my undergraduate classes at Messiah any week. Cardinal's Bible study gathering was not Howard Thurman's interfaith community. The interpretation itself, however, is not surprising because the Solentiname readers were thinking much more about their own contemporary enemies than about the historical characters and caricatures of the Gospel of Luke. In regards to the parable proper, Olivia initiates this part of the discussion, depicting the Samaritan character as a person of another race and another religion, acknowledging Jesus' extreme choice of the enemy as a neighbor. She says, so that we can know that everybody is a neighbor. Jesus' imaginative choice in the parable is inclusive of everybody, not an individual representative of an exclusive party. But Manuel strips the Samaritan of any religious label altogether, especially when he compares him to the other two characters in the parable. He discovers a significant difference between the religious ones and the person he calls the heretic. Some take care of the temple, but not of neighbors, and so they are evil. And the other one didn't care of the temple. He was a heretic, but he was the good one. Along these lines, another unnamed person agrees basically with Manuel, acknowledging what we can find in many contemporary North American commentaries on the parable. It was religion itself that prevented them from loving their neighbor. And that kind of thing is still going on. While some will criticize this liberationist community for what seems like an anti-Jewish tendency, Olivia reminds us that these labels, for example, the person's religion, reveal much more about the self-critique of one's religion within the contemporary context than the ancient one. It's hard to be a Christian, she says, like the Samaritan was. It's easier to be just religious, like so many Catholics are, and be praying to God in the temple. It is not the temples of old that trouble these contemporary interpreters, but the present ones that support abusive governmental regimes and shore up the side of oppressors, or in a posture of neutrality, offer them complicity by their silence. For this Nicaraguan community, reading the Bible was a spiritual practice. Reading the Bible was a political practice. The two, the spiritual and the political, could not be separated easily one from the other. Moving in a different direction altogether, Loreño agrees with Ernesto in his desire to update the language of neighbor to comrade. That's the term he wants to use. It's not easy to discern what neighborly love might mean in the present, he says. So comrade. A comrade was one who held the same political views of those who suffered under the present regime. After the priest chimes in seeking clarification, he continues, love of your neighbor is comradeship. It was not simply giving the man material goods directly. He took him to a hotel and paid for his room and promised to pay extra later. So, in Loreño's words, of course, from then on, they remained friends. They were already comrades. Along these lines, the parable becomes an allegory of their own setting. Distinct from the religious people who disregard people's problems, in their words, the atheists who are revolutionaries are the Good Samaritan of the parable, the good companion, the good comrade. Unsurprisingly at this point in the dialogue, there was a bias against the priest and the Levite as well as against the lawyer. Someone noticed, perhaps due to the religious practice of Bible study in which they were engaged, that the condemnation of all religious people was an improper generalization. The priest cardinal, after all, was guiding the discussion. So a minor debate broke out about whether the religious characters, the priest and the Levite, should not also be included in the concept of neighbors. Insightful it was. Eventually, an unnamed man from San Miguelito responds with insistence, neighbors are the whole human race. Not all agree. They break out again. Manuel will not let him have the last word. Jesus makes it clear that some, because they're selfish, stop being neighbors of others. Sorry to wave my finger. I felt like there was a waving of finger in that comment. Yeah. That this group interpreted this parable in the immediacy of their tension-filled context and found immediate connections between love for God and love for neighbor is unremarkable. It's not remarkable. Other things become remarkable. With respect to the lawyer, their comments moved in the direction of making distinctions between the two types of love. The lawyer failed, from their perspective, to understand how the two were directly linked. According to one participant speaking for the first time in reaction to the absence of loving God, it's that those who love their neighbor are right there loving God. Cardinal affirms this assessment after pointing to several other biblical passages in which love of neighbor is elevated, so that in this parable, Jesus shows that the two are fulfilled by fulfilling the second. Earlier, Cardinal said something similar in reaction to Manuel's distinction between the religious and the heretic. Those who love God without loving their neighbor are not carrying out the law, but they are carrying out the law if they love their neighbor without loving God. This leads to a very interesting repartee on the existence of God between the priest and Lareño, apparently the most revolutionary member of the group. So there are some descriptions in the beginning of this collection that give some characteristics about some of these participants, and that's the characteristic that's listed by Lareño, so the most revolutionary member of the group. If Jesus is saying, here's this dialogue between these two, if Jesus is saying that acting kindly, loving neighbor is the same as loving God, then what might Jesus' words imply about God? Lareño says, he's saying that there's no God, that God is your neighbor. Priest, he's saying that God is love. Lareño, he's saying that to love others, that's God. The priest, he's saying that there is a God, but God is that. Lareño, God is all of us then. The priest, love. All, but united, not separated, hating each other or exploiting each other. So they came to an agreement. And God is present when love is present. And God is present when the community is present. As Morrison might describe it in her fiction, Thriving or Living Well comes from reading the world in relationship with one another. At the end of this jousting scene, Cardinal conjures St. Augustine. St. Augustine says, God is the love with which we love each other, the priest said out loud. The significance of this mini debate within the larger dialogue was not lost on the other participants. Right after Augustine is cited, Alejandro exclaims, what has been said here is very important. Most of us would agree with Alejandro, Augustine, and the priest. In fact, it is difficult to distinguish Cardinal Howard Thurman and Augustine on the topic of love. God is love, as Cardinal writes elsewhere in some of his poetry. And he continues, is there any greater joy than to love and be loved? God is God because God is love, because he is the joy of love. God is the infinite joy of infinite love. If a more naive reader failed to grasp the turn towards civic engagement throughout the dialogue, the political becomes explicit in the ending of the discussion with three specific moments. Near the end, another unnamed person calls out the government-sponsored sermons. That gringo preacher Spencer, who preaches every day sweetly about the spiritual salvation of Christ, he's probably a CIA agent. This statement condemned the U.S. government's support of the Nicaraguan oppressive regime. Clearly, this spiritual salvation was distinct from the message of salvation they themselves were discovering and promoting in their communal Bible interrogations. There was salvation here for them as well, but it was one that encouraged them to lean toward one another in an engagement with liberating practices on earth. A second piece at the end here. Another unnamed person is described as a South American hippie, is how he's described in the book. South American hippie. Recognizes that the enemies, too, are neighbors. Nonetheless, they have been deceived. So he advises others that we must love them too and convince them of the truth. And then finally, here at the end of the dialogue, during this explicit stretch, at the end toward the political, Lareño contributes again. In this recording of the Bible study on the Good Samaritan, Lareño has the last word and final reinterpretation of the account, which in turn may actually sum up well the direction many members of this group were heading. These are his words. And while religion went along that road without looking at the wounded man, communism, which didn't believe in God, has been the good companion that took up the wounded man and took him to a shelter where he could have food and a roof and clothing and medicine, all free. The Good Samaritan for them is the good, generous, financially, emotionally supportive comrade known in their time frame and context as the good revolutionary Christian communist, I would say. What do we learn from this communal practice about interpreting the Samaritan? Many questions remain. The conclusion of the Bible study, like a good Toni Morrison novel, is open-ended. Did they all agree with Lareño's final thoughts? Did they all assume that religion, broadly speaking, and their Catholic faith, even with Cardinal living among them, supported more consistently the status quo? Moreover, this should raise a question for us. Why do many North American Bible studies, theological dialogues, or Sunday sermons ignore the political situation in which we find ourselves? Evident in this weekly gathering, the radical spirit is captivated by love. That is, who has love, how it is defined, and to whom it is given. Along with Augustine and Thurman, this Nicaraguan community desired to grapple with the function of love, but love of neighbor is more than a surface expression, because the neighbor is defined as one wholly committed to the other person's well-being, their spiritual and social well-being. Just one final historical note before we go to Harriet Jacobs. Under the Somoza government, the San Carlos assault destroyed the lay monastery at Solentiname. Several of the participants in this recorded dialogue joined oppositional forces. Some of them died. Before this destruction in 1977, Cardinal then gathered and published the commentaries. Eventually, after the overthrow of Somoza's government in 1979, many of these folks returned to Solentiname. Not long after, those who eventually returned to the community began to paint, to write poetry, and to rebuild. The parable of the Samaritan is a story about something other than forgiveness. Linda Brandt is an odd heroine. In a day when female superheroes grace the screens in movie theaters for good reason, it is hard to imagine a woman who hides out in her grandmother's garret for 7 years as a heroine capable of inspiring future generations. Then again, context is key. And mid-19th century antebellum United States is the setting. Linda Brandt was an African-American woman whose legal status as an enslaved person made her the property of another human being. Her hideout was an attempt to escape her enslaver's sight. Why not escape the South altogether? Well, children were involved. At least her grandmother's house or attic allowed her a daily opportunity to observe their lives, even if she could not intervene in any direct way without revealing her secret. Incidents in the life of a slave girl is a much more complicated story than my brief description implies. And it is a story Harriet Jacobs tells about her life in bondage over 20 years prior. Linda Brandt is her character name in the story. Her narrative is one of dozens of stories written before the American Civil War by formerly enslaved individuals who had escaped the institution of human bondage, supported by the politics and laws of the land. Among these stories, Jacobs is the first one to include on the title page, written by herself. That is the first one written by a female author herself. According to her biographer, Jean Fagan Yellen, it is also the first one to address an explicitly female audience. The title page itself, absent the author's name, carried detailed evidence of this attention to a female audience. A white female editor, Lydia Maria Childs, graced the cover along with an epigram from an unnamed woman of North Carolina that she borrowed from a speech by Angelina Grimke, another famous white abolitionist. Finally, Jacobs apparently marked her title page with the Bible to make her final appeal to women, drawing on words from the book of Isaiah. Rise up, ye women that are at ease. Hear my voice, ye careless daughters. Give ear unto my speech, from Isaiah 32. More importantly for our purposes this evening, the Bible plays a central role in the story Jacobs tells in Incidents. Like many formerly enslaved authors, she found justice to be pivotal to the Bible. Moreover, she used it to appeal to the white women of the North. Other interpreters discussed thus far developed their views of the Samaritan parable within ecclesial circles. Even Luke himself presents Jesus' parable within a larger narrative about a Jesus who brings good news to the poor in a Jewish context that increasingly includes non-Jews. Augustine's sermons and On Christian Doctrine, Thurman's sermons and Jesus and the Disinherited, and Cardinal's organized Bible studies all presume ecclesial environments. Jacob's utilization of the Luke 10 parable, however, was situated intentionally within a broader public conversation, although for a biblically literate audience. Her allusion to the parable reveals to readers much about her understanding of the passage and her alternative way of reading. Her appropriation of Jesus' parable falls within a section called the Church and Slavery. This thematic exploration became common within narrative traditions as the formerly enslaved attempted to describe their experiences of the ecclesial context on southern plantations. Even though Jacobs occasionally named names, this section offered primarily representative examples of these ecclesial situations, especially in the months immediately following the Nat Turner Revolt. In her community in Edenton, North Carolina, many white citizens thought it necessary after the Turner Uprising, in her words, to give the slaves enough of religious instruction to keep them from murdering their masters. Hearing a white minister, in this case the Reverend Mr. Pike, preach sermons on slaves obey your masters from the Bible was common. The key to Pike's sermon, as Jacob records it, was, if you disobey your earthly master, you offend your heavenly master. Such was the conventional religious experience of many enslaved communities during antebellum days. A theological burden was invoked to demand the enslaved person's obedience to her slave-holding master. Jacobs relays how poorly these types of sermons were received by believers of a darker hue. But many would suffer through these white-led services in order to gain some separate time for their, what she calls, Methodist shout. They never seem so happy as when shouting and singing at religious meetings. Nevertheless, Jacobs wanted readers to know what this sort of shouting happiness was limited, that the shouting happiness was limited as well. If you were to hear them at such times, she writes, you might think they were happy. But can that hour of singing and shouting sustain them through the dreary week, toiling without wages, under constant dread of the lash? Fully aware of the public nature of this discourse, Jacobs wrote with the clear objective of intervening on behalf of the downtrodden. Yet her complicated narrative indirectly called into question the sustaining power of both ecclesial communities, white and black. For her, this publication was not the time to critique all religious gatherings. Some spiritual practices opposed human dignity and human longing much more explicitly. Reflecting further on black spirituality, Jacobs detailed a moving reflection on the composition of their own songs, is what she calls them. That is, the songs of the enslaved, what we might call the spirituals today. The context for this narration is one of the most heart-wrenching stories in the entire freedom narrative tradition. When visiting a Methodist church in her youth, Jacobs participated in a testimony service and heard one woman testify that all of her children had been cruelly taken from her, including her youngest, a daughter who was 16. I've got nothing to live for now, she testified. God make my time short. The white leader, the town constable, who bought and sold slaves himself, guiding this part of the testimony service, could not fully grasp the depth of this mother's grief. So other enslaved members broke out with one of their spirituals. Oh, Satan's church is here below. Up to God's free church, I hope to go. In James Cone's general analysis of the spirituals, the word Satan was used as an equivalent for human bondage. To be free from Satan, in Cone's language, to be free from Satan meant to be free for Jesus, who was God making liberation a historical reality. Anyone who was not for the kingdom, to continue Cone's words, anyone who is not for the kingdom is present in the liberating work of Jesus was automatically for Satan, who stood for enslavement. The words of the song reveal much about the theological perspective of enslaved believers, but the words are flat on a written page. I, for one, wish we could hear the tone of the song and catch the deep-seated grief expressed in this communal mourning. Oh, Satan's church is here below. Up to God's free church, I hope to go. Within the context of Jacob's description of the church during slavery, the author recalls the Luke 10 passage. Many of them are sincere and nearer to the gate of heaven than sanctimonious Mr. Pike and other long-faced Christians who see wounded Samaritans and pass by on the other side. Jacob's reversal of the characters in Jesus' story might seem odd at first. That is, the Samaritan became the wounded one in need of assistance in her account. Was this intentional on Jacob's part, or was this a slip, her memory playing a trick on her? I take up much fuller in the larger manuscript a case that this was very intentional on Jacob's part. There are some other things that she does, and the narrative tradition has the Good Samaritan. I found at least 5 different places where the Good Samaritan shows up. And Jacob's was a person, when she first escaped, actually lived above Frederick Douglass, what they called reading rooms. She lived above the reading room where all these narratives were coming, so she had access to these narratives. And also her critical biographer says the same, that she knows her Bible too well. So this is an intentional move on her part. Here, in its present literary context, Jacobs equates Pike and the constable leader of the testimony service with the priest and Levite who pass by on the other side, a phrase directly from the King James Version's translation of Jesus' story. Because she conflates the Samaritan with the victim from the original story, her Samaritan requires help. In Jesus' parable, as you all know, the Samaritan is his imaginative choice for the hero of the story. In Jacob's reuse of this parable, the wounded Samaritan is exemplified in the grieving mother whose children have been violently removed from her grasp. Just as Pike's sermons were unable to soothe the soul, so the unnamed town constable was unable to comfort the enslaved mother who had witnessed the devastating dismantling of her family. With this rhetorical switch, Jacobs associates the wounded Samaritan with the enslaved. What a twist to an old, familiar story. Jacobs identifies with the wounded Samaritan in ways that others, Thurman, Cardinal, expected their audiences to identify with Jesus' Good Samaritan. Jesus' Samaritan was on a journey and was relatively free to do so. But Jacob's observation acknowledges that circumstances may hinder one's ability to act justly in a given situation. As she puts it in her story, I feel that the slave woman ought not to be judged by the same standard as others. In her case, in order to prevent continual sexual harassment from her enslaver, she decided to have children out of wedlock, since a legal marriage was unavailable to her, to have children with a white neighbor. And this decision stood behind this moral reflection. She concludes the chapter on the church and slavery with an ecclesial critique of the white Christianity she had experienced, followed by a more personal reflection on her own situation. Her final example that illustrates the religion of the South as distinct from the Christianity of Christ, as Frederick Douglass would put it, is one of sexual exploitation of the black female body. Her words, "If a pastor has offspring by a woman not his wife, the church dismiss him. If she is a white woman, but if she is colored, it does not hinder his continuing to be their good shepherd." If these were the ministerial expectations in Edenton, North Carolina, then it comes as no surprise that Dr. Flint, her enslaver, who had recently become a member of the local church, continued to seek Linda out despite her married status, despite her legal status. Despite his married status. Yeah. This Jacob's story offered to a public audience her own Me Too moment. This is a confrontation now between her and Dr. Flint. "You can do what I require, and if you are faithful to me, you will be as virtuous as my wife," Dr. Flint replied. I, Linda Brandt, answered that the Bible didn't say so. His voice became hoarse with rage. "How dare you preach to me about your infernal Bible?" he exclaimed. "What right have you, who are my Negro, to talk to me about what you would like and what you wouldn't like? I am your master and you shall obey me." "No wonder the slaves sing," she continues. "Old Satan's church is here below. Up to God's free church, I hope to go." Sharon Carson analyzes Jacob's Bible defense as the most significant theological and political passage in the entire narrative. Jacobs makes a radical claim to a hermeneutics of religious and political freedom. Furthermore, I would add, Jacobs exemplifies her rhetorical skill in the framing of this account with the same slave song recorded earlier. Dr. Flint and other Christians who devalued black bodies were members of Satan's church, unable to assist a wounded Samaritan who may cross their path. So Jacobs views her own character in the story, Linda Brandt, as a wounded Samaritan in need of kind, gracious, compassionate assistance from white audience members in the North. She hopes that her female audience in particular will be able to hear beyond the traditional Christian themes of the songs sung by the enslaved and catch the double meaning of the words as interpreted by those held in bondage. Over against these earlier retellings within the narrative tradition, Jacob's twist on the familiar parable associated the Samaritan who is despised in Jesus' cultural context with the one most in need of assistance in her day, the enslaved. Her Samaritan was not one who acted, but was one who, like the wounded of the original story, longed to receive the helpful actions of others, which was indicative of the lives of the enslaved. Her story was a story about agency, human agency, in the midst of controlled context, often violently so. Catherine McKintrick wisely conjectures that Jacob's time in isolation allowed her to develop the hermeneutical creativity that comes from living in a garret, living in an attic. For McKintrick, the attic allowed Linda Brandt to see and not be seen. In McKintrick's words, she is also not unlike a disembodied master eye, seeing from nowhere. It gave Jacobs the opportunity to reimagine her limited world in unlimited ways. For her own mental well-being, Linda desperately needed to have physical distance from Dr. Flint's gaze. But over an extended period of time, the garret became a complicated space as well. From inside the garret, I would add, Jacobs could attend to two worlds simultaneously and witness her surroundings that were captive and free. Furthermore, because she was semi-trapped in this space for 7 years, the garret becomes a symbol of the nature of slavery on individuals and communities. The garret locates her in and amongst the irrational workings of slavery as a witness, a participant, and a fugitive. Despite the cramped quarters, the physically confined space allowed her to review and to view her enslaved context from another vantage point. It also allowed her to think differently about her God and her Bible. Whatever we might think of how Jacobs imagined her wounded Samaritan, her creative hermeneutical decision to attach this character to the most vulnerable of her day was one way to make relevant the biblical stories of her faith. To the lawyer's opening query, Jesus replied, "How do you read?" Indeed, the way one reads the Bible defines and determines the way a person thinks about life and vice versa. Jacobs had her own reading of the Samaritan story, and it was one in which she conflated two victims from the original story, the one who fell into the hands of the robbers and the Samaritan who was despised in his own cultural setting as an enemy of the Jews, with a third victim, one she knew intimately well. St. Augustine, Howard Thurman, the Solentinamian community, and Harriet Jacobs each represent 4 distinct settings. Nonetheless, they share an interest in the parable of the merciful Samaritan as a productive resource for the thinking and growth of their respective communities. Whatever method he utilized, Augustine found love to be central to the hermeneutical task. So he discovered in these verses the grand story of God's love for all of humanity. In that divine human encounter, the Samaritan represents the Christ figure himself, the epitome of love. Although love was key for Thurman as well, the mid-20th century mystic ascertained from this parable a humanizing tale, a story that allows interpreters an opportunity to speak more clearly about the human experience as they encounter people unlike themselves. For Thurman, the human-human encounter lies at the heart of this first century parable, especially as racial tensions remained at the forefront of this contemporary prophet's concerns. The Solentiname community would uncover from these verses an opportunity to place the spiritual, communal practice of Bible study alongside communal reflection on their political situation. For this South American ecclesial community, the hero of the parable had to be one who stood on the side of the politically oppressed of present-day Nicaragua. Finally, in a less direct analysis of the parable itself, Jacobs reimagined the role of the Samaritan for her contemporary audience. For this creative storyteller, the hero of Jesus' parable overlapped with the wounded figure, is reconceived. The hero of Jesus' parable is reconceived as an analogy for the enslaved in her day, a hero in desperate need of assistance from any northern sisters who would intervene in the human bondage struggle of their day. The approaches to the biblical story of all four interpreters differed as much as the conclusions they drew, but they all recognized the power of one of Jesus' greatest parables on the shape and practices of the lives of people who wrestle with biblical stories to engage with their worlds. These dynamic examples each show us what it means to employ a biblical parable afresh in new settings and new times. We do well to follow their lead. I'm going to just close, if you don't mind, with one more imaginative retelling. We'll let the parable have the last word, but in an imaginative way. I will always love Ahab, even if my parents forbid it. As far as I'm concerned, Ahab is a Jew, but my family insists otherwise. I argue that he's a Jew because his mother is one. They insist that only a father's Judean ancestry can make someone a Jew. How could his Jewish mother, they swear, marry someone from Samaria? We go round and round until one of us storms out of the room. I know they never will allow me to marry him, but I will never love another. I went to the market one day and overheard a rabbi telling a parable. It shocked everyone around me. I left immediately after he finished because I did not want to see or hear what the crowd was going to do or say to this poor-looking traveling teacher. The rabbi told of a person who was injured. I think he was beaten or something like that. I didn't quite catch the beginning of the story. It was clearly something the rabbi was making up. In the story, a priest walked by, and then there was a second person who also passed by the injured man. I'm not sure who it was, a lawyer maybe? And finally, a Samaritan was the third person to pass down this road, which piqued my interest. This Samaritan stopped and recognized that the man needed help, put him on a donkey, and took him to a local innkeeper a few miles away. Get this, in the story, the Samaritan gave the innkeeper money and told him that he would return in about a week and repay him for any other expenses he may have. A Samaritan did this. A Samaritan, one who has been harmed so many times by Jews like the robbers, by Jews like me. But in this story, in this rabbi's story, the Samaritan was a hero. Oh my, you should have heard the chaotic reaction to this Galilean teacher after he told that story. I had to get out of there before there was a riot over a story. On the way home, I thought about how much I wish this rabbi would visit my synagogue and teach there one Sabbath. I don't know if this way of telling stories is a common practice for him, but I would love to hear him talk more about how Jews should interact with others around them, whether they are Greeks, Romans, barbarians, or Samaritans. Hearing this story reminded me how much I love my Ahab. Thank you. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Emerson. We have time for some questions. And the way we'll do it is you can raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic, ask your question, and we'll go from there.
I'm wondering, in terms of perspectives on the Good Samaritan story within Luke chapter 10 itself, whether it's Jesus or Luke, also are having various perspectives, because you also earlier in Luke chapter 10 have the Mary and Martha story, where it appears that the heroine is the one who sits at Jesus' feet and doesn't take action. And is it just coincidence that Luke has got 3x5 file cards and he's throwing stories into the gospel, or he's quite deliberate in making sure that he has somewhat paralleled those two stories in order to say that to sit at the feet of Jesus without some kind of action and compassion. So Luke is kind of wrestling with that problem. Or is it Jesus that's also wrestling with that?
Yeah, no, right. I mean, the story right after this story, right, is Mary and Martha. So, and I decided to do my 2 talks on these later witnesses, but I actually have a whole section going after these sections into an investigation of the narrative itself, Luke 10, right? So I spend quite a bit of time talking about this. It strikes me as one of the things that's interesting is, and I like how you kind of set that up in terms of, is it on 3x5 note cards, right? Are these stories kind of circulating out there and they're just kind of gathering, or is there some intentionality in the narrative? And I would think the latter. That's my assumption is it's the latter. And because of that, I think there's some real necessity to try to read those stories together, to try to pay attention to them. And commentaries are all over the place on this. Some would say, no, these are really separate, and some would say, no, you should read them together. So is the Good Samaritan kind of like a Mary, right? Is Mary kind of like a Good Samaritan? Or is Martha kind of like the innkeeper? I think Bruce Longenecker did an article probably 10 years ago now in which he's really paying attention. He thinks the innkeeper is really crucial in the Good Samaritan story, and the innkeeper doesn't get a lot of attention. And I'm interested in those kind of moves, right? Because, the innkeeper is named, right? Innkeeper. I mean, he doesn't have a name, but he's named in the story, and maybe we should pay attention to that. And he thinks part of it is because of this Mary Martha story. So we've got these 2 characters that are really important. So no, I think Luke is calling on us to kind of try to see those together in some important way. I mean, one of the things about the Luke narrative, as you know, is we have a number of stories in which he pairs an event that happens, and we'll have a male character and then a female character in another story. That right, Luke is the only one that really does that somewhat consistently, right? So he's intentional in that way. And I think this is another possibility here that's going on. Yeah. Thanks for the observation. Yeah.
As you were discussing, obviously, the story of the Samaritan, you mentioned about the other, right? The people who's different, the person who's marginalized by Christ. And the question that Jesus asked, how do you read? When you read the text, we have to consider that the term good is not in the story. I mean, we label, oh, that's a good Latino. That's a good story. And we miss that point. And it'd be interested to trace the history of that label. When did it come about? I would dare say from a more power-based labeling somebody who's other. That's the exception. Isn't that right? I think that's what I would consider.
Yeah, no, right. Which is, why the title, right, is the Good Samaritan good, right? I mean, right, the adjective is completely absent from the story, right? And it strikes me that, that in itself is kind of part of the history of this interpretation. I actually didn't track when that actually became part of it. I'm not sure. That would be interesting to do. But it strikes me as one of those pieces that probably led in some ways to, I think it's 37 states or something like that have Good Samaritan laws, right? Yeah. And Good Samaritan laws are really, I just know this because of the one in Pennsylvania. The Good Samaritan law in Pennsylvania, I'm sure they vary, state to state, but they all do something like protect the Samaritan, right? So we live in a litigious society, and if you want to help someone in need, we have to make sure that during the helping process, you do not cause more harm. So the law is to protect the Samaritan, right? Which is really, really striking. That's fine, that's good. I don't want to be sued if I try to help someone. I get the idea of the law. It's just, that's so far removed from this story in Luke 10, where this Samaritan is not only taking time to put this man in a safe space, but then committing to more beyond that. Now, granted, I understand, right, that this is a different society for a different time, but I just wish we had a different label for those laws, right? I wish we had a different label. Yeah.
I appreciated your reference to comradeship and the comradeship of the Samaritan. And I'd love to hear you just speak a little bit more, if you can, about how that conception of the Samaritan can speak into our contemporary discourse about allyship.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what the Solentiname community was thinking, right? I mean, how do you think about a person who is an ally, right? One who comes alongside and commits. When the term comes up within the Solentiname community in their Bible study, the description is there. I mean, there's a description for the label of who is a comrade. No one says who's a comrade. It's as if everyone kind of knows, but I'm so glad that they laid it out and defined it, right? It's the person who commits not just care and financial resources, but it's also the person who comes alongside in terms of ideas. And, I mean, there's a kind of level of commitment and support that goes beyond what we might think of a friend. I mean, a true friend, yeah, but there again, right, we need an adjective, right? We have friends and then we have true friends, right? The sense of a true friend is one that will really commit, right? The comrade. So a person who is willing to sacrifice more. And I think that's really something powerful to kind of think about, to transfer that into the contemporary moment and think about allies for various things. And how, what does that mean that one comes alongside, right? Suffers with, so takes up one's own being, one's own bodily being in the world, and commits to that, right? That's really what the Solentiname community was pointing, and I think that's a really rich way to think about. And I think in many ways, right, if you can even take Luke's gospel and these three stories about Samaritans, the one where the disciples want to destroy the village because of the response from the Samaritan village, then Jesus' parable, and then Luke 17, the one who returned, this sense of appreciation and well-being. I mean, it's interesting to kind of think about that as comradeship, to spin comradeship through those stories as well. So both as an interpretive tool, but I know you were asking more in terms of contemporary practice, right? And no, I think there's, in many ways, I wonder if, and here I'm just speaking out loud here, but I wonder what was in Harriet Jacobs' mind, right? If the Samaritan is not something she experienced, she has to change that story. She has to turn the Good Samaritan into something other, right? So the sense of comradeship is missing, and so she's looking for that. She's longing for that. Harriet Beecher Stowe, you all may know, right, as the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Jacobs wanted Harriet Beecher Stowe to write her story. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin had been out for about 2 years, I believe it was. It was a short period, But she was now headed to England to support the book, the project. And Harriet Jacobs writes a letter. We have a letter from Harriet Jacobs to Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she has two requests. One, if Harriet Beecher Stowe would write her story, because I don't have the words you have, and the way those words would be useful to my story, right? And then her second request is for her daughter, Harriet Jacobs' daughter, Linda Jacobs, to go with Harriet Beecher Stowe, if she would take her along on this trip to England. Harriet Beecher Stowe said, I'm not going to write that story. I'm not going to write the story. I'm headed to England right now. But she did take Linda with her. And I mean, I just wonder, right? I mean, lots of this is going on. This was a really turning point. The reason why I mention this is because that's a turning point in Harriet Jacobs saying, okay, looks like I'm going to have to write my own story. She had some support from a person by the name of Amy Post, who's a pretty prominent abolitionist at this point, and she said, you just start writing it's going to be okay, just start. And so she sent a couple small snippets into the Herald Tribune, which was a big New York paper at the time, and started to kind of gradually tell this story in print and kind of discover her words. But that was a turning point for her. And so again, I think she alters this Samaritan image because she couldn't find that Samaritan in her own life. And so she had to reimagine a different world beyond that. So.
I have a question, Emerson. You just used the word, actually, imagine, and reimagine. I've heard you several times in this lecture, earlier today in the lecture, and some conversations that we had throughout the day. You've used the word imagination, imaginative. You offered several imaginative readings, retellings of the story. You've sort of noticed the imagination of various authors to do different things with the text. I'm curious if you could just talk about the role of imagination in the process, the practice of biblical interpretation, as you embody it yourself, and as you teach about it, and as you advocate for it. What role ought imagination play in our interpreting and reading the Bible?
One of the things, thanks for the question. One of the things I appreciate about not kind of coming in and doing one lecture, right? Coming in and doing an evening lecture and then you're gone, which, I mean, I've done that before, and it's just that you get a very different, you can get a sense of community, but it's different, right? Than coming in and spending a day and 2 days. And I appreciated the comment, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna remember the person's name now, but the comment today about we're having a Bible study and we're going to be playing with Scripture, right? And I just thought, oh man, you can only say that inside of a seminary, right? Where people appreciate what that means. That's serious play, right? That's not playing. That's not playing. If I say that in my undergraduate context, my students think you're crazy. You know, that's not what we're doing here. So that's for me so important to the process. It's kind of it's how, at least for me, again, this is kind of personal confession here. Personal testimony, right? It's how I think about Scripture as living tradition, alive, right? I mean, it's alive, but what does that mean, right? So for me, it's not just about composing theological doctrines. I recognize the Scripture is used that way. I'm just saying, for me, for it to be alive, there's something that it's also producing. And so in my classes, we spend quite a bit of, we have moments, right? Upper division classes more so than my gen eds, but I do this a little bit with gen eds too, where general education I teach a lot of Bible for general education students, right? And this is that at Messiah, they take 2 courses in theological studies. They do an intro to Bible, and then they do an intro to theology, right? But intro to theology, they have lots of choices. Intro to Bible, they don't. We do an intro to we call it encountering the New Testament, encountering the Old Testament, encountering the Bible, or Encountering the New Testament. So you get 3 options, I guess, but to me that all sounds the same, right? It's not very creative. In theology, you can do all kinds of stuff. Theology, violence, and peace. I mean, I want that, right? So you get a little more interest. In my courses, they don't come in with interest, but they come in with commitments, right? So now how do I get some interest out of them? And I think one of the ways for me that has worked for some students is for us to use our imaginations more. So I ask students to retell stories, right? Let's take a biblical story. That's what we're going to do today. But let's retell that story from another character's perspective, right? And just allow them, I mean, I wouldn't say allow them to play, but I want them to kind of open up. And it oftentimes happens where someone just opens up a story in a way that I think, oh, wow, there goes the lesson for today. I mean, that's it right there. We've got to talk through that was beautiful, what just happened. And it's doing so much. So now I've got to try to, think on my feet and try to creatively try to figure out how to make this, because students, should we take notes on this, right? I mean, you get a lot of, is this going to be on the test? Is this for the test? And just enjoy this moment where someone is actually telling a story. I was expressing earlier about the one named woman in the book of Leviticus is someone by the name of Shelomith. And I teach a women in the Bible class, and we always pause at Shelomith because she's the only named woman in the book of Leviticus, so we should pause there. But we do a retelling around her, and her son has committed an offense against Torah, and now they must stone her. And I had a student who was an English major and a really gifted writer and storyteller. And she told the most beautiful story about Shelomith. And while she's retelling the story that we're all reading, most of my students in that class, I had about 18 or 20 students. Most of them, I'd say 75% of them told the story from the perspective of Moses, which is fine, right? Not a problem. And some of them were good in this retelling. Some of them were just kind of generic, just telling almost, verbatim the exact. But she went in to think deeply about Shelomith. And while Shelomith is actually retelling the story, she's also throwing stones at her own son, following. And it was just, it just kind of opened up Leviticus for us. We ended up spending an extra week in Leviticus, and it became alive. It became alive for me in a way that I had not planned or intended, And so, I'm committed. That doesn't always happen, but it happens enough, these kind of imaginative exercises, that I find that it's necessary to try to frame and to set up as best as possible in a class setting. Usually the events are shorter in time, but frequently, if I hear about anything I've done in classes, those occasional comments that come back, it's going to be about that right there, those works, I remember that time when we did this, or, what I do now in my church is I ask us to do. So they may not take anything else away, but those imaginative pieces are, and so I'm committed to it. I think that when Jesus tells a parable, he's giving us license to think about our stories, to think about the kingdom of God in different ways. And so he tells a story. Did Jesus know of any Samaritan who actually did that activity? It doesn't matter. He imagined it to be so. That's good enough, So I find a certain kind of interpretive freedom in those possibilities, and I think they are rich enough classroom experiences that they're worth pause. I don't do them every class. I don't even do them every week, but I do have structured ones throughout a course's time, and I even have them as formal part of, at least my upper class divisions have formal parts as part of their assignments, as their papers, right? So I find that students are forced to think differently. And I think that's good, to try to think about this story from a different angle. So, yeah. Yeah, thanks for asking, yeah.
Any last burning question? All right.
Don't take too much time.
Okay, short question. Last one.
So, I'm still thinking about your lecture from earlier in the day. And you started it by making reference to 2 mass shootings. There's a philosopher who likes to use the story of the Good Samaritan to develop this idea of the traumatic other. And it's a little bit of a different use, right, of that story. I think as you've been working through it, you've been seeing how subversive the story is, right? How difficult it is to kind of layer it on top of any kind of contemporary narrative that we have about identity or power, right? But I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to why you chose to talk about those mass shootings before opening up this story.
Yeah, I have a really short section later in the project in which I talk a little bit about the trauma of the story, right? I mean, it's not, this actually comes, this is my kind of exegetical moment, right? So I just count up the words. I count up the words in Greek and say what these words are describing this, these words are describing these words. But the trauma part of the story has quite a few words. And even though it doesn't seem, if we're thinking just about kind of a primary theme and those kinds of questions that we often bring, the trauma doesn't seem central to the story, but it's there. It's clearly there. And so I have a little section in which I'm reflecting a little bit. I haven't read enough in trauma theory, and there's actually a kind of a new development over the last, 10 years or so in biblical studies with trauma. I haven't read enough to speak intelligently about it, but there is trauma in that story that to the point that we are left unsure whether the man will ever return to full health. We don't know that from the story. It's sort of like the parable of the 2 sons, right? And the one son at the end we're just unsure if he joins the party of his brother. We're unsure if this man returns. And on the one hand, we could say, well, that's not the point of the story. I get that. But that trauma is real, even though it's imagined, right? It's real because it's not hard to imagine that kind of experience. It's not hard to imagine that kind of event. And it's not hard to imagine the challenges of recovering from something of that. So the trauma is maybe indirect, but it's crucial to that story. And I don't know if I'm ever going to write this, but I have, kind of in my notes, I'm glad that Jesus imagined the trauma. I didn't put that in but I want to kind of do some work around that. The imagining of the trauma is really important as well, right? So, because you can tell that story in a different way. You don't have to focus too much on the trauma, but there's plenty of trauma. I mean, just the idea that I'm going to have to repay you when I get back everything else you spend, right? The fact that he even had to stay overnight. There's just so many pieces, the bandaging of the wounds. And the Greek word, there is traumata in there. And so that we translate as wounds. The word is traumata. It's an accusative form. And so, so there's something going on. I'm not trying to say, right, that Jesus intended or that Luke intended, and for some that's good enough to move on. But the fact that he imagined that level of trauma that required this Samaritan to come and participate is, I still think, more important to the story than what I give credence to at this point. Yeah. So, thanks for the comment. Yeah.
Let's thank Dr. Power.